Page 36, Chapter 13. I kept expecting Mr. Winter to show up at Henry Ford with Jimmy, but he never did. Jimmy never mentioned anything about his father moving back into the house either. It didn't take a genius to figure out something had gone wrong. One weekend toward the end of February, the rain fell so hard Jimmy and I were stuck playing wiffle ball in my garage. I propped up a milk crate on top of an old box. Any ball that went into the crate was a strike. On the opposed wall, we drew lines. If a ball hit above the highest line, it was a homer. The next highest was a triple, and so on. There's no way to throw a wiffle ball fast. It flutters like a knuckleball. You have to stay back on the ball and adjust your swing as you're swinging. Jimmy's bat speed didn't do him any good. The first game we played, I trounced him 11-3. Not that it should have been any big deal, but Jimmy didn't like losing. "Let's play again," he said as soon as he struck out to end the game. I pasted him 8-2. Then 7-4. Another game. He insisted both times immediately after the final out. "Come on, Jimmy," I said after I'd beaten him again. "Let's do something else." But he wouldn't quit. We played Saturday and Sunday. Sometime in there, winning the games became as important to me as it was to him. I could feel how badly he wanted to beat me, and that made me want to make sure he didn't. They were stupid wiffle ball games in the garage, but we played like they were the World Series. We crashed into the wall to take away doubles and triples. We argued about balls that hit on the line. We shredded our elbows trying to throw rainbow curves and hard sliders. We must have played 20 games that weekend, and I won them all. When Jimmy left Sunday, we were hardly talking. The next weekend came up sunny, and I was glad of it. I didn't want to spend any more time cooped up in a dark garage playing wiffle ball and being mad. Besides, Babe Ruth tryouts were coming up. I needed practice hitting fastballs, not wiffle balls. But being out in the sunshine hadn't taken the fire out of Jimmy. He didn't say anything, but that whole afternoon he didn't seem right. It was during my batting practice that it happened. The pitcher's mound at Henry Ford was muddy from the rain. Jimmy had trouble with his follow-through, and I suppose that slowed down his fastball a touch. Anyway, I caught a pitch on the screws and sent a rocker to left. I kept waiting for the ball to bounce, but instead of coming down, it soared over the fence. "A dinger!" I screamed, and I threw both of my arms in the air. I did a little dance, tipped my cap to imaginary fans in the bleachers, flexed my biceps. Jimmy didn't laugh. "One lucky swing doesn't make you Babe Ruth," he yelled. "What's eating you?" I asked. "Nothing's eating me. Just get back in the box." I took my spot in the batter's box, dug in a little, then nodded that I was ready. But I wasn't ready, not for what came. It was a fastball, high and tight, right at my head, that sent me sprawling back into the dirt. The ball smacked into the backstop, and I was up and yelling, "You trying to kill me?" "It was an accident." "That was no accident." Jimmy glared. "Maybe it wasn't. Maybe you need to know that you'll get if you show up a pitcher. We're practicing, Jimmy, and you're not a pitcher. I'm telling you, Seth, don't show me up. And I'm telling you, don't throw at my head. Get back in the box." I wiped the dirt off my pants, picked up my bat, stepped back in. I scowled at him, but the truth is my knees felt like jello. I'd never had a beanball come that close, and it had taken the heart right out of me. I could feel the ball against the side of my head. I could feel it splintering the bones, bruising the tissues, bursting the blood vessels. My mind went back to the model of the human head at the trial. Jimmy's pitch could have killed me. Maybe he didn't know it, but I did. It took every ounce of courage I possessed to stay in that box. The next day, neither of us mentioned what happened, but neither of us had forgotten it. Jimmy kept the ball out over the plate. After a while, my knees firmed up and I started swinging normally. I even nailed another home run, but I didn't act any differently than when I dribbled a grounder up the first base line. "Nice hitting," Jimmy said when I was done, and I knew he meant it. "Thanks," I replied. We walked in silence toward the street. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Jimmy said when we reached his block. "I shouldn't have thrown at you." "Forget it," I said. "I shouldn't have been showboating either." I'd already done that. All right, Chapter 14. I was anxious for Babe Ruth tryouts. I thought I could hit, but I wouldn't really know until I made a solid contact against a real pitcher. The day of the tryouts, I was incredibly nervous. While Jimmy and I played catch to warm up, I couldn't keep from peeking at the other guys around us. They seemed bigger, stronger, faster, better than me. "Don't worry," Jimmy said when the coach called us in. "None of these guys has picked up a ball all winter." I felt better once we started infield practice. I handled the grounders and pop-ups. They hit me okay. And they hit me okay. Next came the situation practice. The coach would yell out something like, "Runner at third, 1 out," before hitting a grounder or a pop-up or a fly ball. A lot of guys would feel the ball okay, but then not know what base to throw to. I always knew what to do when the ball came to me. The last part of the tryout was batting practice. Waiting for my turn, the whole Steve Cannon nightmare came back to me. I was afraid I'd get in the box and not be able to touch anything, but the fastballs they threw me were about what Jimmy had been throwing and maybe a little slower. I never did relax, but that's not the worst thing when you're batting. Tension keeps you sharp. I got 24 pitches and I handled them pretty well. After the last guy hit, the coach spoke. "Listen up, gentlemen. I wish you could all play. But with Little League, adult softball, American Legion, well, there just aren't enough fields. Some of you won't make this team, and I'm sorry, I really am." He paused. "I'll post the roster at the rec center office by noon tomorrow. Thanks for trying out." As we walked home, Jimmy told me I was dead certain to make the team. Don't sweat it. But I did sweat it. That night I kept waking up every hour or so. I relived every moment of the tryout, trying to find a place where I'd screwed up, but I couldn't. I didn't eat the next morning. I tried to kill time watching television, but it was no use. So I slipped into the backyard and pounded the ball off the wall. I must have gone into a trance because the next thing I knew, my mother was at the back door. "It's almost 12:30. I'll give you a ride over to the rec center." Neither of us spoke on the way. My mother pulled into the lot and waited while I went inside. From across the room, the words jumped at me. Redwood City Babe Ruth Reds. I looked down the list, my heart thumping. I spotted Jimmy's name at the bottom, but I couldn't find my own. I felt a numbness come over me. It wasn't fair. I looked again, and there it was at the top. Seth Barham, the first name. I'd looked right past it. On the ride home, I told my mother how lucky I was to make the team, how if they'd thrown me fastballs like Steve Cannon's, I would have been cut. When we pulled up to the front of the house, she turned off the engine and then looked at me. "Seth, I don't want to hear any more about luck. The way you've practiced baseball, the hours you've put into it, you've been exactly like your father was with golf. Exactly. He called it working at his game. That's what you've done. You've worked your way onto that team, so be proud of yourself." Later that night, when I was tossing my baseball into my glove, I thought again about what my mother had said, and a question came to me. My mother was in the front room reading. "What is it, Seth?" she asked me when she saw me in the doorway. "Nothing really, only this afternoon you said my father had to work real hard at golf. I guess I always thought the game came easy to him, that he was a natural." She laughed then, a sad laugh. "According to your father, he was anything but. As a matter of fact, the only thing we argued about were the hours and hours he spent on his golf game. He used to say that he had to practice because he was a lousy golfer. The best lousy golfer in the world, he said, but a lousy golfer. That never made any sense to me. Does it make any sense to you?" I thought for a moment. "Not too much," I said. My mother smiled. "Well, if you ever figure it out, tell me. I'd like to know." Chapter 15, page 42. Mr. Loeffler coached the Redwood City Reds. He was a nice enough guy, but he didn't know a lot about baseball. That didn't bother me. Just being on the team made me happy. I had a full uniform, and I'd be playing on the fields with fresh chalk lines, real fences. "I want you boys to have fun," Mr. Loeffler said. That's what I intended to do. The only hitch was Jimmy. Every time Loeffler gave us a tip, Jimmy would interrupt. "That's wrong. My father says..." At the final practice before our first game, Loeffler had us turning double plays. He positioned us maybe 2 steps from where Mr. Winter would have had us. No big deal. During the game, we could have moved to our old spots, and Loeffler wouldn't have noticed. But Jimmy wouldn't let it go. "We should be in a step and over a step," he insisted. That's how my father would have had us do it. Loeffler had heard enough. He glowered at Jimmy. "Son, I'm getting tired of hearing about what your father would do, especially since I've never seen him. I'd be delighted to have him give up some of his time and help out. If he wants, he can coach the team. Believe me, I'll find something else to do. But until he shows his face, you'll do things my way. Understand?" Jimmy's eyes bore into Loeffler. "Do you understand?" Loeffler repeated. "Yeah, I understand," Jimmy answered, still staring. Walking home after practice, I told Jimmy that Loeffler might have been onto something. "I know he was writing you, but maybe your father could help coach. That way," he stopped me cold. "Seth, you don't know what you're talking about, so why don't you shut up?" He'd never jumped on me before, not like that. I should have told him off, but I was too stunned to say anything. Chapter 16, page 43. The afternoon of our first game was typical for April in California, warm and sunny. My mother didn't go to many of my games, but she drove Jimmy and me to the park for that one. When we got out of the car, she called me back. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, and then she gave me a kiss. I was jittery through warm-ups, and I didn't even think about my mother. But when the ump yelled, "Play ball!" I hustled out to second base, I looked into the stands. There were only about 30 people in the bleachers, so it was easy to catch her eye. She smiled and waved. That's when I spotted Mr. Winter. He was sitting 2 rows behind my mother, his arm around a young woman who was definitely not Jimmy's mother. I looked over to Jimmy. The bill of his cap was pulled down. His eyes were glued on the batter at home plate. But if I'd seen his father, then Jimmy had seen him too. Like a lot of first games, this one started out weird. Our pitcher, Jeff Cole, walked the first 2 San Carlos Mariners on 8 pitches. then struck out the next guy with 3 fastballs down the heart of the plate. Their cleanup hitter took 2 mighty swings and came up empty both times. Then on the 0-2 pitch, he checked his swing and dumped a little flare out of reach into short right. A weak hit, but the run scored. The next batter crushed Cole's first pitch, but he smacked it right at Jimmy. Jimmy gloved it, and his throw doubled the runner off first. I was hitting in the 2 spot, so I ran in, grabbed my bat, and hustled into the on-deck circle. I hadn't felt too nervous in the field, but once I started swinging my bat, I found myself kind of belching and gasping for air. I forgot about my mother, Mr. Winter, his girlfriend, Jimmy. All I was thinking about was myself. Our leadoff hitter, Joey Reichler, grounded out on second pitch. Batter up! The ump yelled, and just like that, I was standing at the plate for my first at-bat in Babe Ruth. Fastball. That's what I was looking for. But that's what I was afraid of, too. Afraid that I wouldn't be able to get around on it, that I'd strike out like I had against Cannon. And a fastball is what I got. Knee-high and down the middle, I pulled the trigger. As long as I live, I'll never forget the feeling that went through the bat and into my hands and up my arms and into my brain. I'd caught the ball squarely and ripped a hard grounder up the middle and into center field. I had a hit, and it had come off a fastball. As I rounded first base, I took a deep breath. When I exhaled, a great calm came over me. For the first time, I really knew I could hit Babe Ruth pitching. There was no time to celebrate, though. I had to get my head back into the game. Harley Jasper nubbed a 2-1 pitch toward the mound. I took off and slid hard into second, but there was no play on me. The pitcher had taken the sure out at first. That brought Jimmy up in a perfect situation to get us both off to a